Literati is a very special session by Mr. Abhijit Basu. Indian culture, its root, continuity, and abiding relevance. We as Indians perhaps understand culture to be a very, not only very specific, but also as something very secular, something which is wide ranging, which has not only vast scope, but also something that means present, past, as well as future. We do take a lot of pride in our culture, but we also appreciate what world culture is. And we as Indians, I realize as a teacher that we are so adaptable, and we are so, we are always ready to embrace new things that have, that come our way, and we have our proof in the past as well as what we see, not only in our generation, but in our, the younger generation as well. What culture actually means. I mean, it doesn't get very simple sometimes, and the kind of the simplicity, at the same time, the kind of complexity that it engages is something that needs to be probably shared, discussed. And the best part is that it is such a subject they always enjoy talking about. So with this, with very kind of knowing Mr. Basu, the kind of study that he has done in this field, we are very happy to have this session with him today. And I'm sure it will leave us with many, probably it will give us many answers. At the same time, we would be prompted to ask him some very pertinent questions as well. So welcome, Mr. Basu, and thank you very much for being here and giving us, a kind of insight into the work that you have done all along. I mean, in the past, you have written your books, you have engaged yourselves in the kind of in-depth study of such a subject. And with this, hope that this is not going to be just one session, but it will be just the beginning of a discussion and engagement that we are going to have over probably in the coming months as well. So I'll just briefly introduce you all to Mr. Basu. Mr. Basu is a published author and one-time CSI research scientist from the Calcutta University. He hails from an old Kolkata-based family of civil servants, professionals, and academics. After a long career in the civil service under the Government of India, he retired as a higher level financial administrator in 2010, and thereafter served for 5 more years as part-time independent director in the corporate sector. An avowed admirer of the ideal of the Renaissance man, Basu, apart from his keen interest in the sciences, has also been a lifelong follower of the liberal arts, especially Sanskrit literature and philosophy, English and Bengali literature and history. He has authored 3 books on Indian heritage, culture, and Sanskrit literature, which have been received well by critics and readers. The names of the books, the first one is The Prophets, Poets, and Philosopher Kings, which was published in 2012. Marvels and Mysteries of the Mahabharata, that was in 2014. And the third one in 2020, which was Perpetual India, Tale of a Timeless People. Since 2012, he has also functioned as freelance consultant editor of a variety of books published by a reputed publishing house. So with a lot of respect and admiration, I invite Mr. Basu for his talk.
Thank you so much, Seemaji. And my Good evening and my greetings to all the esteemed members, which include many of my esteemed friends and associates. And I propose to give a very short prelude to what I am going to talk upon, to be followed by a PowerPoint presentation along with a discussion on the subject. That will be about 50 minutes or so. Thereafter, we can take up any interactive session with reference to questions or answers. Now, coming to the prelude part of it, I can say this topic, Indian culture, its roots, continuity, and abiding relevance, has been working in my mind over years. The present presentation and discussion is based on two of my latest books. One, the one published in 2020, which Simaji mentioned, Perpetual India, Tale of a Timeless People. That book itself is a kind of a digest, as I look at it, of the history and evolution of Indian culture through the ages to the present day. That first part of my talk and presentation will be from elements culled from that book. Second part will be a newer book, which is in making now, awaiting publication with the publisher. It is titled Rethinking India's Myths, Legends, and Cultures. First book, when the thought of it germinated in my mind about the continuity of Indian culture, some 3 decades back, when I read Arnold Toynbee's Study of History. Toynbee mentions Indian and Chinese civilizations as the only 2 civilizations in the world which are continuous. Other civilizations have had breaks, and the present inhabitants of those countries do not have the civilizational memory the way Indians and Chinese have. Now, after reading that, the thought was there in my mind, and thereafter, a few years back, while doing some cultural program, I was going through the lyrics of poet Muhammad Iqbal's Sare Jahan Se Achha lyrics. There, the penultimate stanza of those lyrics contains a line which really triggered my thought again on this topic of continuity of Indian culture. I'll not devote more time in this prelude on that thing because that will be covered in my main talk presentation. Coming to the second part of the presentation, which is on Indian myths and rethinking. That is another thing about Indian culture, which has been engaging my mind ever since I finished my book on Mahabharata and then the Perpetual India book. It is about the significance of some of the many myths and legends in Indian history, which may lend themselves to very significant meanings to a modern mind. Kind of an out-of-the-box thinking if we do. The second book is related to that kind of thought. And the second part of the lecture will also be on that. So without much ado now, I propose to go over to the presentation part first. And in a parallel mode, I'll go on discussing the various points. Can I go over to the presentation, Shivangi?
Yes, sir. Please go ahead.
Okay, share screen I'm doing. Just let the title slide come. This is the title slide, Indian culture, roots, etc., etc. The graphic here is significant. In fact, it is taken from my book Perpetual India, part of it. It shows a sadhak sitting in yogic posture with the flow of time on his background, golden flow of time. And significantly, it shows the 7 chakras in his body, which is developed through his yogic practices, Tantra yogic practices. With the, sorry, I'll go back. With the Muladhara chakra, that is the lowest chakra at the base of the body, up to, with increasing levels of awareness, up to the Sahasrara chakra to the crown of his head, which relates him more to the cosmos. Now, what is culture? Culture, we can define it as a way of life, general customs, ideas, and beliefs of a collective, of a group of people comprising a civilization. It could be a civilization. On a smaller scale, it could be society, or an even smaller scale, it could be an organization. In our present context, we are probe into the roots of the Indian civilization and society, culture, and how, during its long journey astride the so-called arrow of time, its customs, ideas, and beliefs have continued to be relevant to its people. That is the continuity part of it. Time is a defining theme in Indian culture. I mentioned this poet Iqbal's lyrics. Here is it. यूनान अमृतसर उरूमा सब मिट गए जहां से अब तक मगर है बाकी नामो निशा हमारा. This third line is very important for our purpose. कुछ बात है कि हस्ती मिटती नहीं हमारी सदियों रहा है दुश्मन दौरी जमा हमारा. English, Yunnan, Misr, Ruma, Greece, Egypt, Rome have all vanished from this world. Yet there still remain here our name and mark of presence. Something there is indeed that keeps our ethos alive, though for ages we have faced the onslaught of time. This time is very important to Indian civilization. Indian vision of cosmic time, that is India has this two-layered interpretation of time. One is the larger vision of cosmic time and the other was calendrical time. In the words of cosmologist Carl Sagan, taken from his book Cosmos, he says, the Hindu religion is the only one of the world's great faiths dedicated to the idea that the cosmos itself undergoes an immense, indeed an infinite number of births and rebirths. It goes on, it is the only religion in which the time scales correspond to those of modern scientific cosmology. Very significant statement, and it will be substantiated by what we are going to discuss later. Its cycles run from our ordinary day and night, that is 24 hours, to a day and night of Brahma, the creator God, which is, I have to remove this one. How do I do it? Let me see. Which is 8.64 billion years long. Longer than the age of the earth or the sun, and about half the time since the Big Bang. And again, very significantly, there are much longer time scales still. We'll devote more time on this aspect later. Time and gods are two important elements in India's inclusive philosophy. There is first the twin interpretation of Kala, both as earthly death at another level of consciousness as cosmic perpetuity, Mahakal. Their nexus is belief in transmigration of soul, Janmantar. It, that is the Atman, soul, is not killed when the body is killed, says Gita, na hanyate hanyamane sharire. This is an assurance that for Indians transcends physical death. But tell me if I'm too fast, I can go a little earlier. But moksha, or liberation from rebirths and union of the Jivatma with Paramatma Brahma, the one supreme monist entity, is the soul's ultimate goal. It's not easy to achieve that goal. This monist model for the Gyani, that is knower, supplements the polytheist model for the masses who believe in many gods. The two models find harmony in the basic Rigvedic recognition of one truth in many gods. Ekang Sad Vipra Bahudha Vadanti in Rigved's first book itself. India's polytheist inclusiveness facilitated integration of tribes in Indian social order. How? By subsuming the deities in the Hindu pantheon. This is a very important aspect which we will further develop later. We'll cover our talk based on three topics or sections. First is features in India's civilizational continuity. There are distinct features unique to India. Second, Indian concept of time, past, present, and forever. That phrase is taken from T.S. Eliot's time present and time past are both perhaps present in time future. Eliot himself was steeped in Indian philosophy, so this came naturally to him. Then third part is the crux of it, the idea of India. Let us go one by one. Features of Indian continuity. First feature is its uninterrupted sway of common traditions. Even illiterate masses in the remotest village anywhere in India, in a civilizational sense, remember what happened in the proto-historic battles of Ramayana and Mahabharata. In my native state of Bengal, every common man would refer to very old times as the time of Mandhata. Who was Mandhata or Mandhatra? He was a mighty Ikshwaku ruler of very early days. He was, and there are a lot more stories about him, about his might, and about his being faithful to the Vedic religion. Now we have Varna, Gotra, and Vangsha as invariant channels: social for Varna, clan for Gotra, and family continuity for Vangsha. Let us examine them one by one. Now, then we have the three cults of piety, that is worship. One is fire sacrifice, the Vedic yajnas, very little of which is left now in the form of a token havan done in our pujas. Second is image worship or temple worship or murti puja. And third is at the highest level of individual renunciation. But changeover between the first two was significant. We will discuss it. Then we have another unique thing of India, that is the purity of preservation and incantation of Vedic mantras as a marker of permanent continuity. Verses from the Rig Veda are still cited after 3.5 millennia, going by Western estimates, at Hindu marriages and funeral events. Ancient origins of Indian place names, a toponym, is another significant feature of Indian continuity. For example, in a Nimsar in UP, near Lucknow, was originally Naimisharanya. Jabalpur was associated with the atheist philosopher Javali. More of these again later. We come to first part, that is clans and social and family continuity. Varna encompasses the fourfold division of endogamous social classes. Endogamous means marriage permitted only within those classes. It originated in the context of separating quote unquote others from the anthropological term otherism, the supposedly impure dasas in Rig Veda. By late Vedic times, it became a utilitarian feature with hierarchic class division based on division of responsibility, which later degenerated into rigid caste system. Gotras are exogamous septs. Sept means a subdivision of a class to prevent inbreeding in a family clan. It was the opposite to what is done in Varnas. Gotra in Rig Veda meant herd of cows, based on the root go, which in Sanskrit means cow, held as collective family property. Later on, it meant joint family property, including land holdings. Originally defined Brahminical family divisions, the system was later adopted by the followers of those Brahmin priests in other classes. Like Varna, Gotra too has now suffered degeneration, as we have seen from the news about the Khap atrocities. Vangsha is the third type of classification based on family trees. The word Vangsha, meaning bamboo, is significant, with each node of the metaphorical bamboo denoting a family branch. Its unique feature is making food offering, pindadan, for sustenance of the spirits of forefathers, and not only that, and in a wider sense, to the entire Abrahmastamba universe. Abrahmastamba means from the supreme Brahma to the lowest of lowly blade of grass. Let us have an interesting look at this hyperlink, Universality of India's Tarpan mantras, which is related to this kind of rituals. First mantra goes like this. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir, please continue.
Niraharascha ye jiva, pape dharme ratascha ye, teshang appayana etat diyate salilang maya. It means, I offer this sanctified water, salilang, to satisfy all beings that lack sustenance, the nirahar, and all those who are engaged in sinful acts. Look at the expanse of it, look at the coverage of it. But the Hindu does not deem its duty done with the mere act of generally praying for the contentment of the world at large. With the expressed desire for self-cleansing, he further entreats the Almighty in this line, in this mantra. Those who are my kinsmen, or those who are not, or else those who were my kin in past lives, let all of them be eternally contented. Let whosoever may desire my offering of water be sated with it. In this invocation, there is no distinction of related and non-related, of friend and foe, of high and low, of God and demon, of man and animal. It is all encompassing. Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. We come to the next slide. Next feature of Indian continuity is cults of Yajna and Murti Puja.
Microphone mute.
Indus Valley sites, we have fire altars and bone pits. They are found at Kalibangan on the Indian side also, which is to the southwest of Pakistan, Harappa in Pakistan, which relates to 2nd or 3rd millennium BC. These have been interpreted as ritual center for fire sacrifice. But these seem to have been preceded by even earlier, 3rd to 5th millennium BC Old Indus civilization, terracotta mother goddess figurines found in early Indus sites like Mohenjo-daro and Harappa. An even more striking relic of image worship in early Harappan times is the so-called Pashupati seal, supposedly representing the proto-Shiva. Shiva, to my mind, is the original Indian god. Pashupati seal and Great Bath, let us have a look at this hyperlink, it will be of interest. On the left is the Pashupati seal, and on the right is the Great Bath of Mohenjo-daro. The seal was found in a place near the bath itself. According to archaeologists Bridget and Raymond Alchin, the brick platforms by the side of the bath, you can see 4 or 5 of them, might have served as the ritual function of sacrificial altars. Pashupati seal is interesting. It shows a deity sitting in yogic posture with a buffalo with a horn headdress and surrounded by all kinds of animals. Pashupati, as you know, is the name of modern Shiva also. And some Indologists, like Ulf Hiltbeitel, says that it could be alternatively interpreted as Mahisha, the buffalo god. That is Mahishasur. But I doubt that. I think this is original Shiva. That is, let us go to the previous one. No. Why has it come? Let me see previous name. Let us go back to our slide sequence. But sacrifice, not idol worship, was prominent in the Vedas and in the original epics. Murti Puja, temple worship came much later. Worshipping Shiva and Vishnu idols might have caught on since the Maurya period, after people saw the Buddhists and Jain religionists worshipping Buddha and Tirthankar Mahavir in elaborate temples. Thereafter, the Guptas built, they were ardent Vishnu worshippers. The Guptas built many Vishnu temples. What was the sociological significance, the political significance of these temple constructions? By 700 AD, kings found political utility in erecting massive stone temples, which solemnly installed presiding deities in their garbhagrihas, the sanctum sanctora, as a more visibly permanent claim to quote-unquote divine right legitimacy for those kings than the earlier practice of transient Vedic sacrifices. Sacrifices were done elaborately over a few days, but then nothing was left, only ashes. So nothing was left to remind people that the king is blessed by God. Still, for centuries, the two cults might have coexisted, perhaps in the manner of the possible overlap of the two systems between early and mature Indus periods. Significantly, whereas in Harappan times, the fire sacrifice apparently came after image worship, in the post-Vedic stage, the sequence was perhaps reversed. From Vedic Yajna, later on, image worship cult developed. Now we come to the third strand of Indian piety, that is moksha, the ultimate individual goal. In Vedic time itself, there arose a movement, a very philosophically enriched movement, quite different from the cult of sacrificial rituals. It was the Vedantic model of moksha, or individual renunciation, signifying a departure, a basic departure from the original ritualistic model for the benefit of not only the individual, but individual and the society. Because the yajna was performed supposedly for the king only to be blessed and also his subjects to be blessed. This renunciatory model, elaborated by the brilliantly innovative Yajnavalkya, is premised on transmigration of soul in the karma-driven cycle of samsara. Samsara means circling through life, death, and rebirth. Moksha, that is liberation or salvation, is the way to escape this endless cycle of being and becoming by attaining true Gyan, that is knowledge of identity between the Atman, Jivatma, and the Paramatma Brahma. And what is the means to attain that? Action bereft of attachment, Nishkam Karma, that otherwise binds the soul in the samsara cycle. These two goals, Vedic sacrifice to sustain the world process and individual moksha as renunciation of that very process, constitute the two alternative central strands of India's spiritual quest. Now we come to Indian toponym, place names, which is a significant marker of Indian antiquity and continuity. Indian places often bear striking evidence of abiding connection with old traditions. Elsewhere too in the world, there are interesting place names, but mostly they are geographic or generally meaningful indicators, such as Aberdeen, meaning the mouth of the river Dee; Amsterdam, meaning dam on the Amstel; Shanghai, seaport; Tashkent, meaning stone city; Philadelphia, meaning brotherly love. But countless place names in India carry associations with events, myths, or personages of a distant past. Naimisharanya we mentioned, Nimsa, where Vishnu is supposed to have destroyed an Asura army in a split second, or Nimesh. From Nimesh came the name Naimisharanya. Pataliputra, Patna, one of the world's oldest continuously inhabited places, founded by King Ajatashatru to counter the Republican Vaishalis nearby, was named after the son, that is Putra, of a mythical queen Patali. There are other interpretations to this name, Pataliputra also. A very significant name is Tamralipta, which is in Tamluk in West Bengal, Midnapur district near Orissa border. It is a port city from Ashokan times, linked to a lore of the sun god, in which the deity, after peeking into Lord Krishna's dalliance in Vrindavan, is supposed to have blushed a reddish copper hue, tamra color, and became lipta, back into the sea. Now we have this unerring fidelity of Vedic oral discipline as again an element of Indian continuity. Max Muller had wondered at the perfect purity and synchronicity of the Vedic chant throughout India. In 2003, the UNESCO hailed the 3,000-year-old tradition as a masterpiece of the oral and intangible heritage of humanity. The unique tradition is sustained by a phonetic marvel of built-in error detection code, like in modern computer programs, which enabled innumerable generations of gurus to correct even minor flaws, distorting the recitation of Vedas by their disciples. Even the slightest distortion in the inflection of sound of spoken word would be caught by the styles of chanting. The tradition usually consists of 11 types of parts, Veda parts, or styles of chanting the Vedic mantras. These are Sanghita part, Pada part, Krama part, Jata, Mala, Shikha, Rekha, etc. parts. Students are first taught to memorize the Vedas using the three natural recitation styles, Prakriti part styles. These are Sanghita part, means continuous recitation. Pada part means word by word recitation with the Sandhi compounds dissolved to add meaning to what is being recited. And Krama part, sequential recitation, where words are arranged in the pattern of repeated second word, that means to help memory. A, B, B, C, C, D, like that. After students become proficient in these natural or Prakriti part styles, they are put through the other 8 complex or Vikriti part recitation styles. Let us look at what Wayne Howard, American scholar, has to say about Veda recitation in Varanasi. The 4 Vedas are not books in the usual sense. They are comprised rather of tonally accented verses and hypnotic, abstruse melodies, whose proper realizations demand oral instead of visual transmission. That oral transmission is perfected on the basis of Panini's grammar or even prior grammarians, and also on exact pronunciation and inflection of sounds. They are robbed of their essence when transferred to paper, for without the human element, the innumerable nuances and fine intonations, which are inseparable and necessary components of all 4 compilations, are lost completely. We can leave the last bullet. So we can go to the next topic, is that antiquity of old Sanskrit records, which is, first of all, let us see a civilizational comparison. David Frawley, American Vedic scholar, makes an interesting inter-civilizational comparison. The oldest Greek literary sources are the works of Homer, dated around 700 BC. Oldest surviving Semitic books are the Hebrew Old Testament, mostly redone after 500 BC, after the earlier Egyptian and Assyrian conquest and Babylonian captivity of Jews. The Zoroastrian Gathas in Persia originated before the establishment of the ancient Persian Empire by Cyrus the Great in 525 BC, but they are generally thought to be of later vintage than the early Vedic literature. Moreover, they exist only in fragments, the bulk having been destroyed by Greek and Muslim conquests of Persia. But one thing, there is a significant linkage between Indian and Persian civilization, which recurs repeatedly in the language, in the exchange words, in the loan words exchanged between the language of Zend-Avesta and in Vedic Sanskrit. But that is a different topic. We'll not go into that. The oldest records from China are in the I Ching. I Ching is a digest of ethical principles, which was later adopted by Confucius in his teachings. But only its core portions date back to 1000 BC or before. Of course, the Egyptian Book of the Dead, 3000 BC, is of older origin. But we have no surviving tradition or interpretation to characterize its civilizational continuity. Egypt, unlike India or China, is not a continuous civilization. As against these global benchmarks of antiquity, even conservative Western estimates, given in Encyclopedia Britannica and Wendy Doniger, put the Indian chronology of the Vedas and Upanishads between 1500 to 700 BC. Our traditionally say that they are even before that. Versions of the 2 epics between 300 BC to 300 AD, and those of 18 Mahapurans, that is the Matsya Puran, Vishnu Puran, Vayu Puran, Bhagavat, etc., between 250 to 950 AD. If anything, the above time range shows the antiquity and abiding continuity of India's Sanskrit-based traditions over thousands of years. We'll skip this Western chronology of ancient Indian texts to save time. Now we come to the second part of the lecture, second section of the lecture, Indian concept of time, past, present, and forever. Very interesting part. Very cool. Ancient Hindus, Buddhists, and Jains were also pioneers in the perception of time with a capital T as a conjunct of linear earthly time, calendar time, subsumed in the Mahakal metaphysics of cosmic perpetuity. India's great cosmic dream where a new Brahma dreams a new cosmos and a new world, has inspired awe in many a thinker, as exemplified by Carl Sagan's observation about the time concept in Hindu religion, which we have already discussed. The Manusmriti and the Purans meticulously detail the computation of time from the smallest unit of a nimesh, that is a twinkling of an eye, to the mind-boggling year of Brahma, the creator God, worked out as 3,110 billion earthly years. One divine year is 360 times an earthly year. And this Brahma year is far, far more than one can easily comprehend. In between lie the other cosmic periods of yugas, mahayugas, manvantara, and kalpa. The last named, very significant, means a day of Brahma, computed as 8.64 billion terrestrial years. 8.64 to 360 will go take us to 3,110 billion earthly years, year of Brahma. In the language of today's relativistic Einsteinian astroscience, such enormous time scales could be interpreted in line with the phenomenon of quote-unquote time dilation, placing Brahma in a different world, where each day or year is a huge multiple of hours. To explain it more, time slows down in terms of astrophysics. Time slows down in the vicinity of a massive gravitational body, as has been amply validated by fine instrumentation on distant satellites. Hence, the very enormity of Brahma's world would cause a slowdown of time, thereby leading to a huge magnification of Brahma's day or year in our earthly time cycle. This is something so significant in the Indian concept of time that it really becomes a bit difficult to digest how those ancient sages in those times, when Puranas were written, Smritis were written, could reach such conclusions which so closely conform to modern astroscience. Only one conclusion that one may reach is that they were seers. They were seers who could intuitively and internally arrive at conclusions which can be explained only by some interpretations like Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, which says these people are blessed with the pratibha. That means they can discern, see things which are not really amenable to normal thinking. Now let us have a look at what kind of seers they were. They were seers of a mathematical world order. Could anyone ignorant of zero and the decimal place value system, which was an Indian discovery, later taken by Arabs and given to Western countries, have given mathematical expression of such cosmic scales running into trillions, zillions? Imagine the sheer absurdity of the Romans trying to express a Brahma day. Brahma here is an adjective based on the root word Brahma, the creator God. Brahma day or year with their unwieldy L's, C's, D's, M's, and all those vertical lines. Just imagine what Archimedes of 300, 400 BC, the old pioneer of Western mathematics, could have done if he had his command over the Indian concept of the decimal place value system and zero. Instead, what he had to do some based on some exponent-based calculations of sand particles, myriads, based on an initial large index of 10 to the power 8, that is 100 million sand particles. That was his unit, but it was very cumbersome, so it could not be expressed in terms of L's, C's, D's, M's, and all that. Quite obviously, ancient India's mathematical breakthroughs made possible its overlarge cosmic vision. Now, there are interesting inter-civilization exchanges also perhaps were there. The system of 4 yugas is reminiscent of the ancient Greco-Persian quaternary age doctrine. They also said there are 4 ages. In an intriguing throwback to Indian preoccupation with gambling, or Dyuta, the yuga names relate to throws of a 4-sided oblong dice, as we have seen in the Mahabharata TV serials, Shakuni and Yudhishthir playing. Satya Yuga, Krita, relates to Chatur or 4. That is a dice with the value 4. It's a high price dice. Treta relates to 3 or 3. Dwapar relates to Dvi or 2. And finally Kali, which is the losing die, 1 only, symbolic expression of number 1. There are even more interesting things to look at here. What are the lengths of the 4 yugas in divine years? Satya Yuga 4,800 divine years, Treta 3,600, Dwapar 2,400, and Kali 1,200. They descend in neat arithmetic progression of difference of 1,200 divine years between two successive yugas. Each length, again an intercivilizational throwback, each length is divisible by 60, not 10 here, which might suggest a possible link with the Sumerian Babylonian sexagesimal system, which was based on 60. Indian concept of time. Now we come to the interesting Buddhist and Jain traditions, which really boggles one's imagination. First of all, a thing common to all three religions, all three philosophies, Hindu, Buddhist, and Jain. In Puranic cosmology, Kalpa, or lifetime of creation, computed as 4.32 billion earthly years. Kalpa is a day of Brahma, not the day and night. Is an enormously long stretch of time that, according to A.L. Basham, makes the ultimate dissolution through fire and flood, pralaya, comfortably distant. Or as Romila Thapar puts it, the projection of Kalpa as cosmological time in non-astronomical texts like the Smritis and Purans was almost calculated to defeat any controllable sense of time. It's a kind of civilization escapism. It's a kind of ostrich-like mentality. But it was backed by mathematics. In Buddhist and Jain traditions, comfort comes through a hello. Am I audible?
Yes, yes, sir. Please go ahead.
In Buddhist and Jain traditions, comfort comes through a kind of fantasy in which the terminal cataclysm, the pralaya, is made virtually inconceivable through awesome imageries of humongous space. Let us take two examples from the two religions. One Buddhist metaphor of Kalpa is the time taken by silk scarf to erode a huge mountain by brushing it only once in every 100 years. Just imagine how mind-boggling time it will take. In Jain traditions, it is even more fascinating. The wheel of time, or Kal Chakra, consists of zillions of time atoms, each measuring the number of years it would take to empty a cylinder 4 yojanas in length and diameter, which is tightly packed with the body hair of humans, with one hair being taken out every 100 years. Just imagine the scale of it. It is in this sense of effective perpetuity that Emperor Ashok refers in his inscriptions to the continuation of his policies over posterity for a kalpa. Apparently, India's greatest ruler considered her to be a land of timeless continuity. We'll skip over this time to save time. Now we come to another part of our talk, that is the journey from the cosmological time to the terrestrial time, mythical, historical, terrestrial time. The journey is based on what is said in the Puranas. Because India's Puranas is Itihas. After cosmological time, we next travel through its extension into the quote-unquote linear time of mythical first men, and further into the mytho-historical chronology of recorded dynasties of Surya Vangsha and Chandra Vangsha, solar and lunar dynasties. Sorry. No. I will go back to the previous. The last few. Okay. Among the Purans, the Vishnu Puran most strikingly conforms to the 5-featured template of a Panchalakshan Puran, set out in the Amar Kosh aphorism. Sargascha pratisargascha, vangsho manvantaranicha, vangshanucharitan chaiva, Puranam Panchalakshanam. Primary creation of the universe, Sarga. Secondary creation, that is destruction and renovation of worlds, Pratisarga. Genealogy of gods and patriarchs, Vangsho. Reigns of the Manus, Manvantar. And history, that is Vangshanucharit, of the solar and lunar dynasties. Let's now look at a relevant book, Book 3 of the Vishnu Puran, pertaining to the theme of Manus and time cycles, which are important in our context of Indian concept of time and Indian culture, Indian civilization. Manvantaras, Vyasas, Yajnavalkya duties and rights, these are the things covered. We are mainly concerned with Manvantaras and Vyasas. Vyasa is here represented, true to his name, as the divider, the arranger or compiler of the Vedas, the Itihasas, and the Puranas. There are 28 Vyasas in the current Vaivasa of Manvantar. The recurrence of 28 Vyasas during the current Vaivasa of Manvantar with Krishnadeva and Vyasa, the composer of the Mahabharata and the Puran, as the 28th, modeling anew the Hindu scriptures every time, might relate to the unique Indian concept of recurrent time cycles. The 5th chapter details the story of Yajnavalkya, the brilliant original classifier of the 15 divisions comprising the white Yajurveda, Shukla Yajurveda, and also the composer of the biggest Upanishad corpus, Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. Rest of the 3rd book, we can skip over it. Now we come to the 3rd part and the crux of our discussion, that is the idea of India. Is India a mere geographical expression or a nation state in the homogeneous Western mold? Perhaps neither. The turn of phrase mere geographical expression was used by Austrian Chancellor Metternich in the early Napoleonic times, early 19th century, to dismiss nationalistic aspirations of a divided Italy. India is more an emotional concept, an idea of togetherness, bridging differences in ethnicity, faith, and language, making a plurality of peoples into a collectively singular people. India is actually in the minds of Indians. That is why India's national anthem, Jana Gana Mana Adhinayaka, written by the visionary Tagore, invokes its paean, its homage to the transcendental ruler of the minds of all Indian people. The unity of minds is fostered by capacity to include newer peoples and faiths in the Indian fold. Indian polytheism, we come back to that again, mandated by the early Vedic identification of one truth with the dualism of many gods, Ekam Sad Vipra Bahuda Vadanti Rigved, has enabled assimilation of new tribes and clans by including their gods in the Hindu pantheon, often as forms of major Hindu divinities, Durga, Shiva, like that. The people came in and became at home in the Indian civilization because they were allowed to bring their gods in. Continuity of Indian traditions, India's unity and in diversity, it is very important. What is the mechanism of this continuity? Is sustained by a memory bank of cultural traditions, of legends, myths, and proverbs, shared by almost all Indians. The old traditions are transmitted over ages, largely through words, music, and other folk art, into the collective consciousness of generations from all walks of life all over India. The agents of dissemination have been different, of course, but different levels of consciousness. Eminent narrators like Vyas or Valmiki of old, or the Navaratnas enjoying patronage of a Vikramaditya or an Akbar, spread the legends amongst the elite. Amongst the masses, folk songs such as Padavali Kirtan in Bengal, folk theatre like Akhyana in Gujarat, and Jatra in Bengal, and dance forms like Kathak, Odissi, Manipuri, Yakshagan, Bharatanatyam, Kathakali, over north, south, east, west of India, all draw heavily from the epics and Purans, thus sustaining a continuous cultural supply chain from old times to new. One wonders, I think, one wonders whether such a phenomenon is replicated elsewhere. I think not. Only the bards of ancient Greece performed a similar function, but their art was all but forgotten by the Middle Ages. The great biblical stories from the later books of the Old Testament, say the story of Job or the legend of Solomon and Shiva, perhaps remained outside the catchment area of folk traditions in the West. But India has not forgotten her old legends. Now we come to the second part, rethinking the legends of myths of India. First of all, let us take the rethinking the legends of Rama and Krishna. Rama and Krishna, India's two divine lights, are believed to have appeared as Yugavatars, as divine manifestations in two different ages. Ram in the relatively innocent or pure Treta Yuga, when setting example was enough for the masses to follow. Ram was the ultimate exemplar. We'll talk about that later, a little later. Krishna was in the darker twilight age when Dwapar was about to yield place to the immoral Kali Yuga, when clearly pronounced precepts were required to set and coax people onto the right course of action. The following comparison, based on traditional epic and Puranic texts, is relevant. Ram, first of all, was born in a royal palace on a bright sunny midday. Krishna, born in a harsh prison in a grim midnight of torrential rain. Ram belonged to the solar dynasty, Surya Vansha, of the pure and great Ikshaku, was brought up as a prince by his own parents. Krishna belonged to the lunar dynasty, very talented Chandra Vansha, but was brought up as a cowherd by foster parents. Ram remained steadfastly devoted to one wife. Krishna had supposedly 16,108 wives by one count, including 16,100 junior ones liberated from demon bondage of Narakasur of Pragjyotishpur, Assam, and many early dalliances. Ram was revered as the Maryada Purushottam, ideal person of honor, but he never claimed divinity for himself. Krishna was worshipped in his lifetime as Sri Bhagavan of Gita, blessed Lord. He himself proclaimed his divinity as Ishvara. Ram fought all his battles himself. Krishna himself in Gita says, Rama Shastravitam Aham, that among wielders of weapon, among the various vibhutis, the various forms of God, I am Rama. Krishna fought his early battles himself, eschewed arms in the Armageddon at Kurukshetra, but steered the battle with his own strategy to its righteous end. Ram never gave advice to others. His actions served as his precepts. As I said, he was the ultimate exemplar in Indian tradition. In Gita again, we have this famous shloka in the Karma Yoga chapter. Yad yadacharati shreshthas tattad evetaro jana sayat pramanam krute lokastat anuvartate. The shrestha, that is the leaders, the way they behave, the others follow that as examples. Krishna was the preceptor to mankind. His words are the ultimate guide for human action. Ram ended his earthly life in full view of the people of Ayodhya, supposedly taking them all to salvation. Krishna passed away in self-chosen anonymity in a forest, the mistaken quarry of a hunter's arrow. His people, the formidable Yadavs, also met with a sad end, which he chose not to prevent as just retribution for their wild ways. Again, Karman. So this is the kind of example, the study in comparison and contrast. How contrasting these two great hastis were, but at the same time, how they have impacted on Indian civilization and culture. Next is a caveat. For a rational relook at ancient texts, let us take the Manusmriti, a remembered company. This is actually a little controversial ground, but I am saying what I really can make out of it. Others may or may not agree with me. A remembered compilation of customs and beliefs of the Vedic age, held by believers to have come down from the mythical first man. Do I have some more time? Shivangi?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Achha. Some of the sections and verses of the Manusmriti, in fact, may appear anachronistic, even abhorrent to today's liberated minds, such as rigidity of the fourfold division of classes, which has become castes in today's parlance. It originated from the Rig Veda's Purusha Sukta. There's a lot to be said on Purusha Sukta, again controversial territory, but I will not go into this because time may not permit. If time permits, we can revisit this later. Then there are rigid embargoes and supposedly scriptural strictures on interclass marriage, provisions of penance or recompense for infringement of such and other social taboos, such as touching an untouchable, all of that. Many of these were initially intended to prevent admixture of ethnic stock, Varna Shankar, and dominations, quote unquote, of lower classes which gradually hardened into a rigid social stratification to serve the, again, quote unquote, vested interest of a Brahminical upper class. But significantly, the said upper class also had learned members who could meditate and enunciate strikingly lucid principles of permanent validity. Such universally valid enunciations, being relatively less numerous, are often missed in the myriad rigidly regulatory and often socially exclusivist orthodoxy in the Manusmriti. Why this dichotomy between universality and exclusivity in India's foremost Dharma Shastra, that is the Manusmriti? One possible explanation, and that is my way of looking at it, could be that the compilation was an evolved one, in which several sages of different worldviews had contributed at different points of time. It is a challenge for today's humanists to separate the lucidly liberal grains from the rigidly orthodox chaff in the Manusmriti. One particular topic which really fascinates and also is quite revulsive is the position of women as laid down in the Manusmriti. On the topic of women, the Manusmriti contains a whole range of restrictive, even pejorative sections, verses, which would appear to be indicative of a society steeped in rigidly gender-driven orthodoxy. Chapter 9 of the corpus begins with a directive that a woman before marriage should be protected, or rather controlled, by her father, in youth and middle age by her husband, and in old age by her sons. And that such quote-unquote protection or control is justified, keeping in mind the supposedly inherent female frailties, which are indulgent tendencies. These are given in Manusmriti itself: indulgent tendencies, anger, jealousy, craftiness, and bad habits. One is reminded of Shakespeare's quote, "Frailty thy name is woman." But one must also remember that though that phrase of Hamlet was used in a situation of personal anguish about his mother remarrying very shortly after his father's death. There are other such impositions of patriarchal chauvinism, but against all this morass of gender suppression and subjection, the same Manusmriti in its earlier chapter 3, which one believes to be of earlier origin, has this gem of a verse about the reverence with which women were to be treated. This is one of the best shlokas in Manusmriti. Yatra naryasta pujyante ramante tatra devatah. Yatra itastu na pujyante sharvas tatra phalah kriya. Shochanti jamayu atra vinashyatyasu tatkulam na shochanti tu jatraita vardhate tadhi sarvada. Meaning, the gods are kind to the homes where women are treated with honor. Where women are not honored, their all actions or rituals go in vain. Sarvas tatra phalah kriya. Everything is afala. Families where women are unhappy are doomed to be destroyed soon. Homes where women are not unhappy are destined always for greater prosperity. Vardhate tadhi sarvada. It is this kind of societal mindset that must, in the early Vedic age, that must have made possible the emergence of such Vidushis as Gargi and Maitreyi. More Subhashitas from the Manusmriti on why truth is central to righteousness of Dharma, which is a statement of universal validity. Satyam bruyat priyam bruyat, na bruyat satyam apriyam. Priyancha nanritam bruyat, esha dharma sanatana. Speak what is true, speak what is pleasant, but desist from speaking what is pleasant but untrue. That is the eternal principle, Dharma. Let us have just a side look at the truth and conscience, how cynically in modern world people perceive it, though in a satirical vein. We have from Yes Minister, the BBC TV serial, Jim Hackett, the minister, telling his secretary, "I don't want the truth. I want something I can tell Parliament." Then the same secretary has become cabinet secretary in Yes Prime Minister, Sir Humphrey Appleby. He's an old fox. He says to his junior, Bernard Woolley, "What I want is irrelevant, Bernard. It's up to you. What do you want?" Bernard innocently says, because he has still some kind of a idealism left in him, some kind of this perspective for the good left in him. He says, "I want to have a clear conscience." Sir Humphrey, a clear conscience? Bernard, yes. Sir Humphrey, I say, and when did you acquire this taste for luxuries? The above satire is funny, but it also shows us the mirror. Coming back to Manusmriti, there is another gem on financial purity, which is eminently comparable with the most important modern canons of financial propriety. In fact, one can repeat it umpteen times in any human resource development lecture. Sarvesham eva shauchanam artha shaucham param smritam. Yo artha shuchir hi sa shuchir. Namridvari shuchi shuchi. All these, many of the great gems come from the book 5 of Manusmriti or book 4 of Manusmriti. Now, on the subject, coming to the explanation of that sloka on financial purity, of all the purities of body and mind, financial cleanliness is supreme purity. A person, financial cleanliness is artha shaucha. A person who is financially clean is truly pure. Otherwise, cleansing merely with earth and water, which in those days where soap was not there, was the substitute for soap and water, does not make one clean. On the subject of meat eating, here is a liberal counsel which sounds like Greek Epicurean philosophy of indulgent living, though it carries a caveat in the end for higher end living. Namangsha vakshane dosho namadena cha maithune pravrittiresha bhutanang nivrittistu mahaphala. There is no sin in consuming meat or alcoholic drinks or even in sexual acts. These are natural inclinations of living beings. But that caveat, abstention is greatly rewarding. Now we come to an epic character, Yudhishthira. 7 o'clock. Should I stop here? Is time running out?
You can take another 5 minutes, Abhijit ji, if
Okay. Let me say.
then we can take questions. I'm sure this kind.
Right.
This
I
must
know.
have led to several questions.
I know. Just I'll try to. This Yudhishthira part I'll do and then I'll leave it. Okay. Because this this character Yudhishthira of Mahabharata is, I think, one of the oldest persons in Indian traditions who could think out of the box, like Edward de Bono of today. In the Mahabharata, Yudhishthira's answers to accursed serpent Nahush, who was a king, father of the king Yayati, was accursed by sage Agastya to become a python. And then in the second episode, Yudhishthira's answers to God Dharma, disguised as a yaksha, still make us wonder at their eternal significance. Quickly through these episodes, serpent, there is python and Nahusha episode. The python asks, who is a Brahman? Yudhishthira's answer, one with the qualities of truthfulness, charity, forgiveness, pure character, non-cruelty, austerity, and compassion, is a Brahman. Python, but even Shudras could have those qualities. Yudhishthira Shudra, who has these qualities, is not a Shudra, he is a Brahman. And a Brahman bereft of these should be deemed a Shudra. Could there have been a more emancipated philosopher? That too at a time, a few thousand years ago. Another episode of Yudhishthira and Dharma Yaksha. The Yaksha asks, what is poison? Kimancha Visham. Yudhishthira answers, Prarthana Visham. Prayer is poison. Maybe Prarthana or any kind of soliciting is poison to philosopher King Yudhishthira, as it runs against Purushakar, human effort. If so, it is a liberated principle indeed. Yaksha then asks, what is Daya, compassion? Yudhishthira, Daya is wishing happiness to all beings, not just being kind. It should be more positive. Make all beings happy. Yaksha, what is Snan, bathing, ablution? Yudhishthira, Snan is removing mind's impurities, manomal, not just body's impurities. Yaksha, what is Dan, charity? Yudhishthira, Dan is protecting all beings. Again, a positive spin to what we know about charity. Do not these answers indicate a liberated free thinker rather than one tutored in homilies from Shastras or scriptures? Now we come to the other aspect of free thinkers, logicians, and atheists, where it is discussed the role of disputation in Indian culture. And all of them, those free thinkers, logicians, and atheists, all of them have been accepted in the Indian society as respected people. We have given the example of Javali and others there. But I'll stop here because otherwise much time will not be left for discussion. Thank you.
Mrinalini, may I now request you to take over from here?
Thank you, ma'am. Thanks for having me. Thanks a lot, sir, for this captivating lecture on Indian culture. And especially, I'm kind of baffled by the concept of time and how it is kind of described in Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism. I never really thought about it. I never studied it. So it's really baffling and it's amusing. So I have a few questions. Firstly, sir, I wanted to know more about this shloka in the Rig Veda, Ekam Sadve Bahuda Vedanti, as in it really encompasses different faiths together, and I think it's probably an effort to bring people from different faith into a single whole. So I just wanted to know more about it. If you can please elaborate.
No, that is a very relevant, a very important question, because that Ekang Sadvipra Bahuda Vadanti is fundamental to the Indian concept of tolerance. Not only tolerance, embracing all religions. That is what Vivekananda said in his famous Chicago lecture, that Hinduism thrives on its acceptance of the best things in all religions. That is what is the essence of survival of Hinduism as a practice, forgetting all the bigotries and other things that may have come in later. But the fundamental idea is that everyone has something to say, and if it reaches God, as Krishna himself says in the Gita, that whatever way one worships me, he always comes to me. So this is the basic meaning of Ekang Sadvipra. And just imagine Rig Veda at a time when people were worshipping natural phenomena. They were fearful of those, but still they had the vision to think in those terms of embracing everyone with a thought about the ultimate.
Thank you so much, sir. So another question I have, that is about the names of the places like Nemisar and Jabalpur. Like you've mentioned, sir, I had read somewhere that Nemishar was also a forest, mystical forest in the Ramayana and Mahabharata. Can you please enlighten me more on this?
Yeah, that again is very pertinent question. Naimisharanya, in fact, earlier it was not a forest. It was Vishnu through his Sudarshan Chakra there to destroy the Asura army. And that place where Sudarshan Chakra fell, where everything was destroyed, ashes and all that. Ashes perhaps acted as fertilizer. And there later on came a big forest there. That is the Naimisharanya, where Sauti first recounted the Mahabharata to Kulapati Shaunak in his ashram in Naimisharanya. It holds a very important place in Indian taxonomy.
Thank you so much, sir. So another question that I have is, like you've mentioned that the yugs were named after the four-sided oblong dices. So, sir, did it have any symbolic association, like Kali was the losing die? So was it symbolism?
It was a symbolism in the sense that losing die won. In fact, it kills all hope. Kali was apparently then regarded as a hopeless period, when people will lose their consciousness of virtues and this thing, difference between what is dharma and adharma. There will be more and more tendencies to pursue adharma. So, and they will need very strict guidance to lead on to dharma. So, Kali losing die being named as the dice one is significant in that way.
Thank you so much, sir. So while you were giving the lecture, I actually bought the ebook Prophets, Poets and Philosophers King, which I'm going to read. I'm very excited to read this book. I request all the participants and audience, if they have any question, they can pose it directly or they can type it in the chat box.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Mrinalini, for initiating the question answer session. Yes, I mean, everybody, I think congratulations, Abhijit ji. I mean, this was such a erudite talk. I mean, I'm actually, the word baffled, which Mrinalini had used, so am I. And it's been an extraordinary, experience to, I mean, I'm actually aghast at the kind of range that you have. I mean, the kind of works that you have read and studied them actually. One question which I would like to, share with you is, I'm in curiosity, out of curiosity. I mean, we have talked about all these scriptures. We have our, from different religions, you have substantiated. What are we having, or what do we have to offer from our generation towards this continuity?
No, that is again a very moot point. Of late, one finds there is a renewed interest in Indian heritage and culture among the younger generations. And what is important is to lead them on, or is to guide them on to the correct understanding of our destiny. It should not necessarily be a narrow and what is blowing our own drums and we are the best in the world like that. Ours have been a very, very organically involved philosophy. Our religion, Gita is not a religion, it is a religious book, it is a philosophical book. It has a tremendous wealth of knowledge and information given to an ideal code of conduct for a person. So that way, these are the ways we should try to propagate the ancient Indian knowledge which have survived through centuries and millennia. I don't know whether I have addressed your question properly or not.
Yes, partly, but in terms of, something tangible, if we have to, like say that, yes, after 50 years or maybe 100 years, this would be this particular work or this particular, these traditions or something like that, which can be, really the way we are talking about our past, philosophies and scriptures. What is the probability? What is the probability of something that we have, you may say, in the last, millennium or so?
No, that is again a fundamental question. In fact, I believe that a basic thing we should address is that I think Sanskrit is totally disappearing from India now. In fact, I took up my studies in Sanskrit from the age of 30, 35, or 40 because my father had left a lot of books. I wanted to read them, and I had some school grounding in Sanskrit for 2-3 years. So I again read up the grammar and all that. But it really opens up a wealth of information about your country before you. But unfortunately, that is being neglected. But I don't know how they'll do it, but because the proper professional education also required, English, of course, one must have, and the other languages, vernacular languages are important. But this basic grounding in Sanskrit, people should have. Then only they can have a proper idea of what Indian civilization means.
Thanks. Thank you so much. Maybe have a few more questions. I'm sure there are.
May I ask something?
Yeah,
Simaji,
please do.
I'm Dr. Veena Sinha.
Yes, Dr. Veena Sinha, please.
Yeah. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. It was really interesting to listen to Abhijit ji, and it was actually just pulled every one of us into the past. But at the same time, as the Seema was asking about the future prospects of this kind of thinking, continuity of our culture and religion. So I think, Abhijit, it's a quite a interesting thing that we constantly evolved during these times.
Very true.
Even they were never so pure, because we every time we got someone to influence them, and we actually evolved over them. And
Right.
Similarly, I hope we are still evolving, because our diaspora is now in the entire world, it is everywhere, and they're taking some seeds along with them, which is actually previously only in this Jambu Dvipa, see this limited part of world or the earth. But these thoughts are gradually spreading everywhere in every continent, and the people, they are spreading these thoughts. So I think this will continue, and we are forgetting, but people are coming from the different part of the world, and they are learning these things. And when we listen these things in the remotest part of the Europe, in the Innsbruck or in the America, then we just really astonished that they know more than us. As Abhijit ji was quoting people from the America and the different learned people. and they come to Varanasi and they learn and they go back. So I think this is the way now it will continue in the world and will actually accommodate everything in the knowledge bank and the think tanks of our times.
No, quite right. In
That's
fact,
nice. Thank you. And thank you so much, Abhijit. It's
No.
actually, I was just absorbed into your lecture, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much. In fact, I also agree with you that proper propagation of the real Indian tolerance. I think what we basically miss out, the kind of divisiveness is coming in the name of religion and culture in our country, was not there earlier actually. That's why I wanted to address the term of heterodoxy, how even atheists, like an atheist like Javali was accepted as Brahmanottam. That is the best of Brahmins. So this is the Indian culture. We don't dismiss other people who hold different views. They, in fact, we hold them in high regard. That is what I think, that is what many of the Western scholars, in fact, I think H.G. Wells, while talking on Gita, he says this is a fantastic thing where everyone can relate to. One who believes in idolatry, hundreds of gods and others. One who believes in only one God. One who does not believe, all of them can relate to it. This is the fundamental strength of it. This is the thing we should try to propagate instead of sowing divisions within us. That is what I find a little painful. Thank you. Any other
Can I ask a
questions?
question?
Please, Neptune. How are
Yes,
you?
Abhijit.
Florida.
Good. Thank you. Good morning. Good evening, your time. It was very interesting talk. I never thought that such a hardcore science person like me could listen to a lecture for an hour with apt attention. But it was a very interesting talk.
Yeah.
But my question was, I mean, the present time, as you said, that people are forgetting Sanskrit and we are possibly maybe forgetting our heritage. I have a question from our Indian history. I mean, we had dark ages. Was it like the present time? People had forgotten about their heritage, about their culture, about Sanskrit, about Shastras, but then they rose again from the ashes. So what do you think of the future? Do you think we'll rise again, or we are rising, or whatever? What's your reading on that?
That is a very, very fundamental, very question that goes deep into the truth of our existence as a civilization. In fact, there were dark ages in India, medieval times and all that. People are steeped in superstition and others. In our own Bengal, that Bengal Renaissance was a kind of Navajagaran. Beyond those dark ages of India, where lots of atrocities were committed, satidahas were happening, and the people were coming, young widows were left to fend for themselves. So like that. So every time, and actually in Bengal, again, I can say, Sri Chaitanya's movement, that is Bhakti movement, which embraced all castes and people in a single cloak of Vaishnavism. That again was another regeneration. So from time to time, because ours is a very old civilization, it happens. Highs and lows are there. We may be in a middle ground now, not very high, not very low, but there are always chances of going up or going down also. We have to contend with that all the time. But I remember you are pursuing a lot of works on reviving the Jain Purans and other heritage. I hope you are doing something on that, because they are fantastic works we must have.
Yeah, we started that. That's going on, but right now I'm taking time off to do my Himalayan research.
As a geologist par excellence.
So it will remain, right? Our culture will remain. I mean, it won't get vanquished.
I don't think so. I don't think so. It has survived so many onslaughts. Like that famous Iqbal quote. We have survived so many onslaughts of time and other things on it. We will survive. Only thing, the idea is to improve.
Mrinalini, can we just see if there are any more questions? Then you can I think wrap up, Pranali.
Ma'am, they are just messages
All right.
of
So I think,
congratulations.
yeah,
sir.
so you can wrap up now.
Okay. I really would like to thank Abhijit sir on behalf of Club Literati for this invigorating and scintillating session, for enlightening us more about the importance of Indian culture. And at least I have a lot of things which I'm going to research more about after this lecture. This was really, I would say, an eye-opener, because there were so many aspects of Indian culture which I didn't know, existed. And of course, the most important thing, which is a takeaway from this lecture, is the importance of Sanskrit language. I think if we want to study ancient Indian culture, we should have some command over the Sanskrit language, which is a lesson for me because I want to research in this area. I would like to thank all the audience for joining us for this session. It's this interesting and captivating session, for asking such relevant questions. I would like to thank the Literati family, who's always they have this ever-growing enthusiasm for everything new, in learning different things. And of course, Seema ma'am, for organizing such beautiful and interesting sessions time to time. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It was a delightful experience for me too. And my heartfelt thanks to all those who have put questions, and I can see some of their comments also. They're very encouraging. And also Seema ma'am and you for the next excellent way this session has been conducted.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks, Abhijit ji, and we really look forward to sharing ideas with you and listening to your so very well researched domain. This is absolutely a fantastic experience for all of us. Thank you so much. Thanks all for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. So I'm leaving now. Okay.
Yeah, thank you.